actually. Yeah. I'm pulling out a tablet. Everybody's got the laptops open. Is Tony on?
Tony is on.
Tony's on. Okay, I want to call the meeting to order. Mr. Harris, do we have a quorum?
We do.
Okay. Do we need to officially do a roll call?
We do.
Okay, let's call the roll then, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barber. Ms. Byrne.
Here.
Ms. Cook.
Here.
Mr. Dastra.
Here.
Ms. Elias.
Here.
Mr. Feldman.
Here.
Mr. McGround.
Here.
Ms. Rufo.
Here.
And Chair Adams.
I'm here. So we have a quorum. Thank you. First order of business are the minutes from the last meeting. You all received a copy. Hopefully, are there any changes, corrections to be made to the minutes? Hearing none, ask for unanimous consent to approve the minutes. Any objection? None heard, so approval of the minutes. Just following my notes. Next item, not a whole lot to report of the chair. One item, just as a kind of a disclosure, I think many of us, if not all of us, were contacted by Representative Sturla wanting to meet to discuss just home rule. If you met with him or if you did not, that's a personal choice. There is no requirement to either way. I do just to say that I did meet with him a couple of weeks ago, and interesting discussion, but it does bring up an issue he and I discussed, and I just wanted to make it public, about adding in Representative Sturla, and maybe this will actually come under the next officials to interview as possible candidates, and Representative, Wade L. as possible candidates to interview, so we can get some questions asked about what's going on in the state with this relationship and so on. It was one of the things we had talked about. Another item that I had is just wanted to point out that I would like to, and again, we will bring this up later, but just sort of getting it out publicly, the possibility of adding in sort of informational meetings, possibly starting in September. So we will discuss it. My thought would be, and it'd be up to the commission to decide how they wanted to proceed or not proceed with this, is set up extra meeting, probably about 4, so we could get out of city council chambers into the city, with the goal strictly being, let's hear from the public. The public can ask questions, and we will hear what they have to say. So that's something that I was hoping we might be able to discuss a little later under the other. I have had no other outside contacts. Vice Chair Rufo, as the public liaison, have you received any correspondence, any comments?
No, I've pointed the press to a few links that they were looking for, but other than that, nothing else.
Okay, great. Thank you. One last thing, and I forgot at the beginning, just for those who are in attendance, this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. So with respect to privacy issues, just so you are aware of this. Next item, public comments. Are there any?
Quick interruption on my part over here.
Yeah, Mr. Dastro, yeah, sorry.
Did we hit live on the live stream?
It should be streaming.
Should be. Okay. Look. I'm probably just having technical issues on that end. I see it now. My apologies.
I will say that as somebody who teaches some courses in computer science, I have absolutely no idea how to do live streaming. So I defer to Mr. Harris on every part of that. Okay, hopefully it is working. It is not? Okay.
It's not showing up for you? I don't know if we have any delay on this or not. It ought to be,
It is working now. I think I was just having issues because I tuned in before it started. I've refreshed and found it.
Okay, so we are, hopefully everything is fine. Wonderful, thank you. Anyways, back to public comments. Are there any members of the public who have any items that they would like to present? Keep in mind, if you do, please give us your name and your street in which you live. Okay, are none? Our first order of new business is PEL has a presentation for this month, educational presentation on the budget and taxation. So I will turn it over to Mr. Cross and Mr. Reddick.
flip up those screens there, you'd be able to see it. There are screens that are embedded in the dais here. So if you flip those up, then you should be able to see the presentation that's on the screen.
Okay,
You can see it here if you want.
Sorry, not enough for everybody, but you can
I'll use my own.
and it will be on the screen behind you as well for those from the public.
That one might be broken. Oh, maybe
No,
just,
it's just not on,
that one.
well, they really thought of everything.
didn't they? Jeez. Hook my house up. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chair, are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, please. I
Okay.
think we got things open, so.
Okay,
Please
good
continue.
evening. Again, I'm Fred Reddick with the Economy League, and Jerry Cross is with me. We're going to be going back and forth as we go through the presentation. We spent a lot of time with you. You have spent a lot of time dealing with the organizational issues of city government. A lot of the work that the homework that we've discussed with you and provided you has dealt with organizational structure. Tonight, presentation is going to focus on the financial structure of the city to discuss the city finances, city budget, taxation-related issues. The organizational structure is reflected on the organizational chart, and just briefly to review that you have the 4 elected positions within city government: the city treasurer, controller, mayor, and city council. Those are the elected positions in the current structure under the optional charter Plan A provisions. And then currently there are 6 departments. The charter does provide for up to 9 departments. You've chosen to establish 6, and you'll see the organizational structure of those departments reflected there. The financial structure of the city shares the same authorization for revenue and expenses as for all third-class cities. So there really isn't a significant amount of flexibility with respect to the financial structure, and we'll go into that in some detail as we go through the presentation.
So,
Just to be ready.
well, I'm certainly a novice at this, aren't I? Okay, it seems to be working. My apologies for the phone call. I'm on baby watch, so I had to take that. It was my son, otherwise I would have ignored it, but any day now, and I'm here. The financial structure of the city is something you don't think about as integral to the city's structure. It's easy to imagine the organizational chart, the layout of the city offices, the elected officials, those have names and titles and duties. But the city has another structure that enables those other portions of the city to actually operate. It's the paycheck. It's the source of revenue. And municipalities have a unusual stream of revenue. It was based on permits, taxes, fees, things that the government can demand and ask citizens to pay for it. In exchange for that, they get the services. The other side of the financial structure is how they spend that money on the services that the citizens expect. And that's locally determined. So your financial structure is one of revenues that are controlled at the state level and to a certain extent, the ability for the local people to pay them. And the other side is the expenses, which are determined locally by the budget process and of course by elected officials. The problem comes in my view, when you share the same sources with the other component units of government. It's the wrong word to use, the other similar units of government that have wildly divergent services, and they are tapped into the same property tax base, the same personal property tax base, but they give totally different services. If you were to look at the distribution of property taxes anywhere in Pennsylvania, I'll wager that the school district is probably 60 to 70% of your local tax bill on the same property. Municipalities generally 20% or so, or 25% or less, and the county goes back and forth. So the county is in second place or third place. My point being, the next time you have a need for a fire or a policeman, you would call the school district, because logically they take the lion's share of the money. They would give the lion's share of the services. In Pennsylvania, that's not the case. So when the city has to provide services, and that's part of your study and how well the city structure is allowing that, remember your structure is shared by other governments that the citizens don't realize are different, but provide very different services, but they're getting the same type of tax dollar, which is a natural conflict. So we tried to express the budget and the revenues in this balance beam. It doesn't look as good as it looked on my computer, but that's an imbalance. And the thing to see there is taxes make up 2/3 of the revenues. So taxes are really the pressure point for citizens. And fees, Lancaster has a very healthy fee structure, a very healthy departmental structure where there is revenue coming in, there is the reimbursements and such. That's a relatively large number, 12%. You have active health housing codes, which brings in about 3%. You see how quickly that falls off from 12%. And the other sources of income, which we can go into later, brings in a large amount, 1/6, 17%. Offsetting this in the budget, and this is where the ability to provide services come in, you'll see that very nearly the amount of money spent on compensation and benefits for the employees that provide the services is very close to the total amount of taxes. So when you look at the services provided, you are getting nearly every tax dollar that comes in can be matched by an outgoing expense, either by compensation or benefits paid, but it's active, current employees working for the city. The next expenditure item is a mandated pension. City has certain mandates on the state side to provide a certain level of pensions, and it's a historical entity, so it has lots of people that formerly worked here, and it has a pension bill that equals about 11% of the budget. Coincidentally, your fees for public works and safety are about 11%, 12% to be exact. So you see that total expenses are 74%, 3/4 of your budget goes towards both the employees that are current and those that have been current. So you have a legacy employment base and you have an active employee base, but you have a very large expense side that is required. Very simple reason for that is government is labor intensive. We have not figured out yet how to deliver government services without a person in the position. Debt service is actually very nominal. It's at 9%. I think the GFOA standards are anything over 10 is good. Anything under 10 is fine. It is very manageable, but you'll notice that the other expenses are matched conveniently by the other revenues. So you see the structure is very well balanced, but whether it's balanced to give services for the revenues available is something you'll study as part of your government study. You have to understand that while the budgets are balanced, with the constraints of the fiscal structure, whether or not that structure is providing enough to provide adequate services. You're getting services now because the city has to balance its budget, but what else could they, what other constraints cause them to have either different levels of service than needed or changes in levels of service from years past?
All right, we're going to next move to how the city builds their budget and break down the revenues. First of all, as Jerry indicated, taxes represent about 2/3 roughly of the revenues. There are two categories of taxes. One deals with property, real estate, and the other deals with personal earnings. With property taxes, you have both the real estate tax itself, a millage that is imposed on property, and you also have the realty transfer tax, which is a tax imposed whenever a property changes hands. Personal earnings, you have the earned income tax, which is a percent on the earnings that an individual has, and then you have the local services tax, or LST, which is a tax on those individuals who are working within the community, whether they live in the community or not. The tax limits, both in terms of property and earnings, are established and limited by current state law. The millage on property is established under the Third Class City Code at 30 mills, and Act 511 addresses basically the other taxes. You also have revenue coming from various fees and charges, things like permits, building permits, cable TV franchise, issues like that are fees or fines from the police department that are generated. And then you have other sources which are primarily intergovernmental revenues coming from federal government, the state government, the county government, things like the liquid fuels tax, which is a state tax imposed on gasoline that is rebated back to local governments. Pension aid, the city receives funding to help to offset the cost of your pension obligations. And you also have transfers that come in. You know, the city does receive transfers coming in for services provided to the utility funds that are transferred back into the general fund. On the expenditure side, as Jerry indicated, employee costs represent roughly 3/4 of the city's budget. That includes current personnel costs, as well as what are referred to as legacy costs, which are costs associated with retirees, things like the pension obligation and the other post-employment benefits, known as OPEB liabilities that the city has. You have debt service, which is approximately 9% of the city's budget. Again, a reasonable level for the city within the best practices of the government finance officers' recommendations. And then you have services, supplies, and capital, which is an investment into infrastructure.
I'd like to ask one question.
Yes.
Currently, do you know what debt service the city entails, what they are currently paying off? Any specifics?
Right offhand, I don't know without going back to the budget itself. We can get that answer for you, though, but it's in the budget.
I'm just wondering about long-term, short-term, how that works.
It's going to be a long-term obligation. Exactly what the current maturity levels are for outstanding debt, I don't know, but we can pursue that and get you a response back.
Okay, great, thank you.
But yeah, typically, debt service is dealing with multi-year debt as opposed to current year obligations. Next slide looks at tax structure.
Excuse me 1 second. Can we go back to the previous
Oh,
slide?
yes, sure. yeah.
There's a question, I have a question about the utility fees. Does that include, can you give examples of the utilities that you're referring to?
Water and sewer
Just water and sewer?
and stormwater, those three utilities. There are reimbursements that do come back to the general fund from those three utilities for costs that are incurred.
Is there anything else, any other?
Those are the three utilities that provide transfers back to the general fund. Now, utilities in another sense deal with the cost that the city is paying for electric service, for your traffic lights, your street lights. Those are utility expenditures. So
Okay.
you have a revenue component coming
And then you have-
internally from city funds, and then you have obligations on the expenditure side for utility costs that the city is paying for outside utilities that are provided.
Are there any charges for the one cable service that's in the area?
Yes, there is a cable franchise fee that the city receives every year, and that's noted under the fees and charges. The city does receive under a cable franchise agreement. Again, the exact dollar amount is in the budget, but you do receive that on an annual basis.
The city receives that.
The city receives that, and that's a revenue into the general fund.
Yeah, you provide the franchise agreement that limits who can do cable business in your town, and for that, there's an agreement based on how many subscribers and whatever the fees are that you negotiate with them.
Okay.
Is that specifically
I guess I.
cable, or is that just any, with, as you said, the new internet service that the city's bringing in, would that be, also get a fee from that, or is
I
that
don't think so.
separate?
I'm trying to remember, I just went through negotiations with a cable last year. Maybe the solicitor could help, but the internet wasn't considered under the FCC definitions, I think. Am I off
The
on that?
franchise fees are governed by the Telecommunications Act.
There you go.
Telecommunications Act provides for a franchise fee to municipalities to be negotiated with the telecommunications provider. Internet is specifically excluded, so it's only governing what we would call, what you would view as cable television. So if you're referring to what was introduced at council last evening, which is an agreement coming with Shentel, Shentel will be doing what Comcast does, and there will ultimately be a franchise agreement between city and Shentel for a portion of Shentel's revenues limited to the portion that's governed by the telecommunications provisions of their services to the city, just as the city's current franchise agreement with Comcast is again limited to only their revenues in the city from the telecommunications portions, internet again being specifically excluded.
And we did take a quick look at the budget. It's roughly about $500,000 that's coming from the franchise fee.
550,000 from the franchise in the budget.
From Comcast.
Is that the only franchise fee, Barry, that you have, is the 550 listed in the budget? 550?
Comcast, the only franchise at this point.
Currently, the only franchise in the city is Comcast. That's fairly typical. It's rare that you have multiples in a city. We actually are going to have two, which is actually a positive for the city coming forward. But yes, that's the only current franchise agreement from a telecommunication provider with the city of Lancaster.
So will all of these be identified by line item?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. If you
Okay.
take a look at the city budget, they're very clearly defined in the
Okay.
budget. Yeah, line item.
That's fairly typical. It's rare with multiple. Going to have two is actually a positive for the city going forward, but yes, that's the only current franchise agreement.
Is that Tony?
He's watching.
Sorry, Tony, can you mute yourself?
And it's on short delay.
Was he asking a question?
Sounded
Not
No.
that I can hear now.
Okay, okay. Moving to the tax slide then. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see the current taxes that the city is imposing as part of the 2023 budget. You're imposing a real estate tax for general purposes of 11.7 mils. Under the third-class city code, the maximum is 30 mils that can be imposed for general purposes. There are, and if we move to the far right column, a number of special purpose real estate levies that can be imposed for things such as debt service, recreation, library, shade trees. You then have the earned income tax, which the city imposes at a rate of 0.5%. The total obligation on a city resident is 1%, but as was noted earlier, this is a shared tax. 0.5% stays with the city and 0.5% goes to the school district. The city, a number of years ago, took advantage of what was referred to as the occupation elimination legislation, and you eliminated the occupation tax at that time. I believe that was somewhere around 2008 or thereabouts. In place of the occupation tax, you're imposing an additional 0.1% on earned income. So the city is getting 0.6% total from the earned income tax. The city is also imposing a local services tax. The total rate is $52. $5 goes to the school district and $47 stays with the city. The city imposes a realty transfer tax. The total imposition is 1%. Again, this is a shared tax. 0.5% goes to the school district and 0.5% with the city. And the city is imposing a $50 mechanical device tax. The middle column shows the statutory limits that are authorized either by the third-class city code or by Act 511. And as was indicated, with the exception of the real estate tax, you've maxed out on the Act 511 taxes, the earned income tax, the local services tax, the realty transfer tax. You're precluded from imposing an occupation tax because of the action that was taken to eliminate that tax and substitute 0.1% earned income tax. And the city has never imposed a business gross receipts tax. So under the tax reform legislation of back in 1987, I believe it was, or 88, is now prohibited from imposing a business gross receipts tax. That was, even though that legislation did not come to fruition in terms of being fully implemented, the one provision that was implemented was the prohibition against either increasing the rate or imposing a new business gross receipts tax. Are there any other questions on taxes before we move on? Yes, Carl.
The items in the authorized for third-class cities section here, are those authorized for a third-class city, or are they acceptable under the Plan A charter that we have? I know that we don't employ any of them.
Yeah, the charter Plan A provision does not address taxes. It refers back to the third-class city code. However, with the exception of the real estate tax, the other taxes are governed by another act, Act 511, known as the Local Tax Enabling Act, which is a law of general application across the board for all local governments. So those are the two statutes, the third-class city code and the Local Tax Enabling Act, that govern taxes that can be imposed by the city.
Can you give me, like, in that third column, can you give me an example of how a city would implement like a shade tree tax? Like, how does that?
It would be a tax on real estate, and it would need to be equivalent to the expenditure for shade trees that were being imposed by the city. The same is true with recreation or debt service or library.
Many cities have a shade tree commission that's charged with the maintenance and the upkeep of the city's shade trees.
But it has to be a one-to-one equivalency.
So, it's available to you to be used for both installation of trees and maintenance of trees?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Removal, cleanup, yeah.
So did everything in that column kind of operate along the same lines as the fees?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Does everything in that column operate along the same lines as revenue derived through fees? Like I think the deal with the fees is you can't impose a fee that's disproportionate to the actual cost to perform it. And it sounds like you said
Yeah,
these taxes all have to kind of equal out.
correct.
And so,
Special purpose.
They do.
like the library, for example, we have a public library, but it's not the city's public library, and therefore it probably wouldn't be acceptable to levy a tax for expenditures to support the library because you can't marry those two things up.
Yeah, it has to be a one-to-one equivalency, yes.
Okay.
Your debt service could be levied higher than the annual debt service, but the money has to be dedicated to either putting in reserve to spend the debt down or paying against the debt. Amy,
I can't tell. Oh, yeah. In the middle column, you're saying that not all are available to Lancaster. I got a little lost. Which ones are not available?
Okay, the the ones that are not available right now would be the occupation, both flat rate or millage, because you replace the occupation tax with 0.1% of EIT. So those two are not available. And then going down to the bottom, the business gross receipts tax is also not available because it was never imposed by the city, or if it was, it did not exist at the time that the local tax reform legislation was enacted back in 1988.
And the other ones, the residence, business license, per capita, we're not using those right now.
You're not using the per capita, you are using, let me see.
Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
you're not using the per capita at this point in time, no.
Okay, thanks.
per capita tax is a good example of the consequences of state legislation governing your taxes. The occupation tax is shared with the school district, right? And oftentimes it is more expensive to collect that tax or almost break even. But what's more important is that tax has never been adjusted for inflation. So that was a 1965 $10 tax. I remember 1965, and if I had a $10 bill, it was my birthday or something going on, because that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money. The way we looked at it, it's equivalent to over $70 today.
Many municipalities have either done, if they did have an occupation tax, they replaced it, and have chosen not to impose the per capita, because both of those taxes, as Mr. Cross indicated, are very expensive to collect in terms of the return of the revenue. There has been legislation that was enacted that increased the local services tax from what started out to be a $10 tax up to the $52 limit, which is more representative of at least having a relatively recent or relatively reasonable revenue from that tax. There have been efforts to increase that even further legislatively, but they have not been successful at this time. Carl?
I have a question. But there's a lag, so I'll wait to be called on.
Should I wait?
I didn't get it.
I didn't either.
So there's a lag, Tony?
Yeah, I'm just watching the live stream, because it's better audio, so I apologize if I interrupt at weird moments. I just had a question about the mechanical devices tax. Like, what exactly is a mechanical device tax, and does it apply to automobiles?
No, it's jukeboxes.
No, it's,
Jukeboxes.
yeah, it's amusement machines, pinball machines,
Penny arcade,
arcade type of machines.
seriously, penny arcade, gumball machines, baseball card machines,
Oh, okay.
pinball.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the budget.
I'm gonna jump back to the live stream because it's way easier audio wise. I just wanted to ask that question for some clarity.
I had two questions about the taxing availabilities that we have now, I guess. The per capita tax, it's literally a head tax, like everybody
Yeah.
in your household
Over
18.
over 18 years old.
over
Sometimes
18,
capped at 65.
$10. There it is. It does, okay.
Yeah, and you
And-
share that with the school district also.
Yeah.
So that's really a $5 net. A lot of times give a $10, a 10% discount on payments, so it's a $4.50.
And those that do impose it typically have an exoneration process for low-income individuals too.
The EIT is distinguished by resident, Act 24 resident and non-resident.
Right.
And can you break that down for me again, please?
Yeah, the earned income tax imposed under Act 511 is 1% shared with the school district, so 0.5% to each. The 0.1% then is the replacement for the occupation tax. That goes solely to the city. The non-resident tax is imposed at 1%. However, with respect to the non-resident tax, there is a credit back to the home jurisdiction, so that if a non-resident is paying that tax in their home jurisdiction, then the city would not receive anything because there's a credit back. If the non-resident is in a municipality that does not impose an earned income tax, you would receive that 1%. But I would say that there are very few municipalities that don't impose that tax.
So it looks to be the case that among what's available to any municipality for revenue like ours, the revenue sources from non-residents is pretty much restricted to the local services tax.
That's correct, yes.
That work in the city.
I just had some questions about the non-real estate tax. If you could go over who would be taxed, like earned income tax and wages, that would only apply to the people that live within the city, is that correct?
Residents.
Residents,
Just the
correct.
residents that live
Right,
in the city?
and typically you'll see that as a deduction on your payroll.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then also, I know we do not allow the business gross receipts, but if that was something that we would want to do, if we did a charter, would we be permitted to do that, and how would that work?
No, you would not be
would
permitted to
not.
do that, no, because of the legislation back in 1988. Without legislation to change that, if there was legislation at
In
the state level
that
to
would
change it.
change it,
Right.
okay. And so is there no way to tax tourists
I'm sorry,
tourists that come in the city?
Mm,
Is there any way that we could tax someone coming within the city as a tourist?
as a tourist,
Yes.
you're not taxing the individual, no, there's no way to tax the individual coming in.
But the transactions may be, but that would be under gross business,
That would,
and you can't have
and we
gross
can't have
business.
gross business.
You do have a non-resident local services tax, so if there's people employed in the city, in all the occupations, you're getting some money from that.
Yeah, the tourism industry is generating employment in the city.
Mhm.
So the employment would be taxable through either the local services tax and the earned income tax for those individuals that are working to support the tourism.
It makes sense.
Thank you.
What is the community colleges tax?
I'm sorry.
Community colleges, it says
Oh.
special purpose tax on
Yeah,
community
that,
colleges?
that is authorized, that there is an authorization, again, on a one-to-one equivalency, but to support a community college, there can be, I'm not familiar with any municipality that has imposed that, but it is in the statute.
It's a 50-year-old plus when seriously, when community colleges were being developed in the 60s there was, I want to say, a county had levied that, but after it was done paying off the initial, it was a lot of times startup, getting acquisition of properties, beginning expenses, but many community colleges are old enough now that once that tax, as Fred said, it's a one-to-one. If you don't need it for the purposes levied, you don't have it any longer.
Okay, so it's just, it is a tax to support community
Yes,
college,
correct.
not a tax against community
No,
college.
no.
Okay.
It's to support.
That's what I was wondering about. I
Yeah,
thought,
usually the special purposes are for that. They're for special purpose.
like the shade
targeted.
trees.
Right.
Yes, okay.
The distressed pension system recovery program is an example. That's a revenue on earned income tax. You can add to your earned income tax, but that money has to go to your pension. And you have to be distressed pension to begin with.
I wanted to just make a comment. Ms. Bird, I think you were talking about, there are there ways to have revenue to the city from not necessarily residents? And I think that's something we should definitely be thinking about. And unfortunately, it looks like what's in front of us doesn't give us those ways, but maybe there are other sources of revenue as we go through this process that we'll come upon. So I've been thinking about that a lot too.
Okay.
The caveat for that in any charter or any government, you cannot create subjects to taxation that the legislature has not created.
Yeah.
You cannot create a new thing to tax, whether it's a business activity or a person, occupation, company.
So you can't, my understanding is the city can't create a sales tax.
That's correct.
Correct.
Okay.
You cannot, no.
That was the impression I had. I just wanted to make sure that was
There
clear.
was
Not that I want to create a sales tax.
Well, there are two areas in Pennsylvania with, Allegheny County and Philadelphia County have dedicated sales taxes for dedicated purposes. There was a movement in the early 2007 or 8 or so that the budget of, I think it was the last budget of Rendell, he put a county optional sales tax in. It didn't get very far, but that would have been a county level sales tax distributed proportionally among the municipalities. But those are very hard to enact because it's tax. And if we can't change the 1965 rate from $10, what's the chances of getting a whole new tax?
Could you clarify the EIT resident tax is, are people who are retired taxed on their retirement income?
No, retirement income
Oh,
is not.
that's an earned
It's
income
earned,
tax.
right.
So it's W-2 wages, for example, small business income, I want to say Schedule C, that kind of.
Yeah, the business, right. Business would
Okay.
be subject.
Yeah, but that is one of the, as we'll get into the property tax, that is one of the inequities built into the system. The fact that you never stop paying property taxes, but you do stop paying earned income when you stop earning income, or if you never earn income, you don't pay that tax.
Right.
But you still get the benefit of the services.
To kind of summarize the chart, at this point, really the only available option for the city is on the real estate tax, where you are under the current statutory limit of 30 mils, you're imposing 11.7 mils.
You're saying the real estate tax is the only,
Available revenue source that can be imposed above, the caps that exist on the other taxes.
as it is now?
Yeah, you're at your limits
Correct,
across the board, except for real estate.
right.
Right, okay.
And real estate has a limit, you just have not reached it yet.
I have a couple questions. I won't really be able to respond, but my only two questions right now are, one, I know Ms. Bird asked about tourists. Is the hotel tax a county-controlled tax, and would we have any influence there? And then two, in regards to the community college tax that we don't currently use, I understand it has to be a 1-to-1 ratio. Could that be utilized to send local residents to the local community colleges in regards to their tuition costs?
In response to the first question, the hotel tax is a county tax that would not be available to the city. In response to the second question, I don't believe that would be an eligible activity. It has to deal with supporting the community college itself.
I'm aware that there are certain places in the state, I think Harrisburg, Allentown, and Altoona, that utilize essentially a portion of their property tax, on land value. And I wonder where that falls into this authorized tax kind of diagram.
That's that'll be we'll get into that with the next couple of slides, but that's based on this value of the property.
Okay.
So it's a split rate. So the idea being that, okay.
I think it's appropriate maybe
yes.
to move to the next slide because that gets into this issue.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You want to talk about, any other questions on the 511 nuisance and property taxes?
Yes, just one clarification on the previous slide. Thank you.
Oops, I went the wrong way.
The Earned Income Tax Resident and the Earned Income Act 24 Resident, can you repeat what the difference
Yeah,
between the two?
the EIT on residents is 1% under Act 511, shared equally with the school district. The additional 0.1% came about when the city decided to replace the occupation tax with an additional 0.1%. At the time they did that, they had to equate the revenue from the occupation tax that was being received with an equivalent percentage of earned income tax. So it was determined at that point in time that the revenue from the occupation tax equaled 0.1% on earned income. Now, one advantage of the earned income tax is that there is a natural growth associated with it as the economy moves forward, as people's earnings increase from year to year. There is an inflationary element associated with some growth in that tax, and we'll get into that a little bit later too. You can see what the growth is.
The Act 24 EIT was by referendum. So the citizens had to understand the choice they were making. And the choice they were making was the occupational tax was a tax on the value of your occupation. And the county actually levied, I don't remember if Lancaster had a percentage or millage, I don't remember. But the county actually, as part of its assessment function, values occupations. That goes back to the idea that my father was a cobbler, I'm a cobbler, I inherited a business from him, that business is worth something, I should pay a tax on it. It was very heavily used in central Pennsylvania. Historically, because of the large amount of land that was owned under agricultural use and not densely developed. So the the occupation tax, in some cases in central Pennsylvania, was more than the real estate tax. So as counties got less and less involved in literally saying a brewer is worth less than a lawyer who's worth as much as, you can look up all charts that they used to value these occupations at. Counties simply went to a uniform, like everybody's occupation is worth $3,000. And then the towns would then levy a millage against that. And it was no limit. And if you were a large landowner, or if your township was mainly agricultural, you didn't want to pay on land, so you paid on occupation. But that was a largely central Pennsylvania. Northeast, western Pennsylvania, not so much.
At one point in my career, I was a tax collector that collected the occupation tax, and I had to justify to people, and I could not justify to people the fact that, a teacher starting in year one earned $6,000. A teacher 30 years tenure earned $50,000, and yet they were assessed the same and they paid the same tax. I mean, the equity, that's just one example. The equity was not there.
Yeah.
It was a good decision to move to the earned income tax, which is a percent based on earnings.
It was a modernization of the tax code led by the complaints of locals. So when the legislators had gotten sick of hearing about this tax, seriously, and then they did it as a replacement tax. So they said, all the money you're getting from that, you can replace with this tax, but no more. So they couldn't be accused of raising taxes. So this is the dynamic you have when state government controls from Harrisburg, controls all the individual 2,500 children of municipalities that they have. So you can see that inherent conflict.
Right.
Schools have done a really good job of transferring the blame for school taxes to the legislature. If local governments would do that, okay. I have to watch the editorialism. This is live, right?
We can move on to the property
Let's
tax
go.
part of this.
Yeah, let's-
Yes, please.
Yeah, let's go. Come on. This is going well, though. The questions are good. Thank you for that. Okay, the basic building blocks of your tax structure, your financial structure, is based on property wealth and on your personal earnings. That is it in a nutshell, as you can see from the percentage of taxes later on. Literally, Pennsylvania is geared to tax the home you live on and when you sell it, and it's geared to tax the earnings you make to maintain a house. In both ways, that is a benefit and a detriment. The city is on the detrimental side, as you can see from the charts. The city's median household income, the 50% mark, is it's about $53,000 or so. The county in a median household income is $72,500. So you'll see that earned income at a fixed rate of 0.5%, which is what everyone in the county has to levy, generates by nature more outside of the city than it does in the city. That's a built-in tax burden disadvantage for the city, okay? City has to generate a lot more services than perhaps a township or a smaller borough on a smaller tax base, okay? Same thing with the home you owe when they tax the wealth, the idea being if you can afford your own home, you're a wealthy person. The median housing value in Lancaster reflects the long-standing historical part of the city. Outside of the city, the median value is approaching $250,000. It barely breaks 100,000 in the city. I forget if it's 124 or whatever.
124.
Yeah. So you see you're at a disadvantage when your neighbors are operating under the same code as you are, but from a different pot of wealth. They have a bigger well to draw from, so they can draw a smaller cup, but has more volume. You have a smaller well, same size cup, you don't get the volume, but you have demands. You have a lot of services that perhaps aren't provided or weren't provided. Remember, you've been providing police and fire for decades. You are now still paying for some of the services provided in the 70s and 80s.
Carl, you asked about the land value tax. There is an ability to impose a separate tax on land and a separate tax on improvements on that land. That's not something the city has currently done. Oftentimes, not a lot of municipalities have done that, but some that have fairly large expanses of undeveloped land. I know from my experience, some of the communities out in western Pennsylvania that had steel mills on and the mills were gone, they moved in that direction because there was a significant amount of undeveloped land and they could levy what's called the land value tax, a separate tax on land versus a separate tax on improvements, and you have two different millages then that could be imposed. You would have to still maintain, you would need to do a calculation to determine that the aggregate tax was within the 30 mil limit.
The single millage equivalent, yeah.
Right.
And you mentioned Altoona. Altoona got rid of the land value taxation scheme when the county reassessed. Johnstown has a land value scheme, but the rates are the same. Scranton City still has a split tax rate. They are moving towards eliminating that in the new reassessment. Harrisburg thought about it back in 2011. It's still in place, I believe.
Yeah.
It's a very controversial topic. If you do any research on the literature, I'm not sure we did a lot published in that report we gave you about 1965, but there is a lot of arguing that this is a incentive to development. This is to make the carrying cost of undeveloped land prohibitive, so you'll be forced to put something on it so you don't lose money on your land. As Fred said, if you don't have a lot of undeveloped land, the tax becomes just another way of splitting the tax bill. Oftentimes, you see cities just raising the rate the same on both of them. The problem you have with that tax is eventually it gets out of whack. And if you try to go to a single system, you are penalizing people severely. It may be a small number of people, but the tax is severe. So it's a disincentive to get away from that. The literature will tell you that it's there's proponents, they are very proponent-minded, right?
Yes.
I'm a Georgist.
You know? Okay, so you know.
You know.
They point to Pennsylvania as the model. There's good research. It's really a usable tax if you meet the criteria for the tax. That's the problem. Whether a city does or not, I just did this research 6 months ago. Between Pittsburgh got rid of it. Pittsburgh and Scranton were since 1913. And the research that was done, the most recent paper was like 2020, and it was an update of an earlier paper. Their conclusion was it really does work, but only for a short time or a limited time until things even out and it just becomes a tax mechanism.
I'd be interested in just keeping this on our radar as something to keep in mind. I think there's more reasons why it has value that I don't need to go into today because we want to get through this presentation, but
Sure.
I just encourage.
But you have that ability now.
Yeah,
in the
you
city.
do have
You
that.
have that ability now.
The Henry George Society would be glad to talk to you about
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we can give you something. We've always had
Love to
public
talk to
meetings.
them.
Yeah, they're true believers in that.
Yeah.
And Pennsylvania is on the vanguard, always has been. But as I said, the research that's been developed is like, it's something to consider if it works for you. Okay? So assessed valuation leads into that. The assessed valuation is,
Can I just jump in with one quick note on that, just for, mostly for Carl? At one point, I did ask Patrick Hopkins, business manager, about that. The city has done some analysis of that, which is probably available to us. Their conclusion was that it would not work in Lancaster City.
I've seen that, and I remember part of the challenge was that the frequency of assessments was a driving factor, and we have done an assessment recently.
that's exactly right.
But the information should be available.
No, you're exactly right. Well, you know the topic, so, I'm not gonna, you're absolutely right. And that gets to this slide.
Would that be something that the commission would want to look at?
I mean, this would be one I'd actually ask Mr. Harris. Would it be possible to get a copy of that study?
I imagine I could try to find a copy of that, yes.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
When you get into the assessed valuation, we're essentially talking about the split rate. Each property by law is valued based on assessment law, and it composed of two values, the value of the land and the value of the improvements on the land. Most municipalities, the counties provide them with totals, and the municipality sets their millage rate based on the revenue target, and they set a millage rate against the assessed valuation. So taxes, a real estate tax bill is two pieces. It's the valuation and the millage. They have to equal the amount of money you want. So it's an equation. If you need $100 and your assessed valuations are 50, your tax is 2. 2 times 50 is 100. If you need $100 and your assessed valuations are 33, your tax is 3. It equals out to 100 because you have to, it's simply an equation to develop revenue. The problem comes in when values of properties change and the assessment for real estate purposes does not change. And prior to 1993, every time you bought a house or sold a property, your assessment was changed to reflect that. So there was a rolling reassessment in a sense, and the cities and municipalities saw growth in property values by natural means, much like what Fred said about earned income tax. As the earned income value goes up, your revenues go up. There was a case in West Virginia, I think it was, that was declared unconstitutional. It was called the Hello Neighbor or Hello Stranger Act. The first thing you got when you got a new house was a bigger tax bill. So that's out of the game in Pennsylvania. So since 1994 or so, it has been a very flat across the board in Pennsylvania, subject to reassessment occurrences. The bad news for a municipality is that it causes stagnant real estate revenue absent real estate tax increases. So the burden for raising revenue falls exclusively on the governing body. Because if the values don't change, the math has to work out. If one side of the equation is going down, the other side the other component has to go up, right? To equal a given revenue. This chart shows the history of assessments in the city. Let's start from the current assessments. Those are equitable by any measure. If you have a market value set by the state that does it every 2 years, looks at the sales, arm's length sales in the county, comes up with an aggregate market value for the city, it's about 43% growth since 2008. The assessed valuation grew by 39% since 2008. So the city, in effect, has received 39% more tax dollars from the growth in the revenue base, in the value of the properties. That's the good news. The bad news is the market value, the wavy line going up, is climbing. But because the city doesn't gain value from that absent a reassessment, it is a long, slow, flat line between assessments and reassessments. So the city for years sees no real growth on the assessment side, therefore millages have to go up. When there's an adjustment on a reassessment, you see what happens? It catches up because the principle of mass appraisal should catch up market value to assessed value. And this chart, if you read the chart correctly, you'll see that for several years, the value of properties assessment in Lancaster City was higher than their market value. That's a function of mass appraisal. But the market and the methods bring it back down to where they're equal. In the future, you can expect that level line to start to stay level and market value continue off that graph, if market value continues its historic growth. So the city will then continue to fall backwards in its valuation growth. So I would say in 5 to 10 years, it's going to start to be flat again, which means the city can only raise revenue under real estate by raising the millage, which is a political decision. And that's when the cap comes in.
None of the municipalities can capture additional revenue from the reassessment, and the reassessment choice is always at the county level. Is that right?
The county normally is responsible for the assessment policies for the county, but cities and boroughs can have their own assessment office?
Cities. I don't think
Cities.
boroughs
I thought boroughs could, okay. But cities can have, and there's not very many left that have their own assessment office.
So, but in theory, a city could do its own assessments?
Yes,
Yes.
but you have to have an assessment office, you have to have an assessment process in place, you have to essentially have a junior county assessment office. But there's a few cities left that do that.
And in doing on the point about the assessment, there's something about the assessment in which you cannot gain revenue from the process of the
Well,
assessment.
on the
There's a
reassessment,
5% limit.
Yeah.
There's whenever you go through a countywide reassessment, there's a 5% limit in terms of, you have to adjust your millage then down to
Okay.
not exceed 5% of the revenue.
105%, yeah,
Yeah.
105%.
Yeah.
But that is in the aggregate. So in a reassessment, you will have winners and losers and people that stay the same depending on how long that property has existed under that assessment. The rule of thumb is a third, a third, and a third, but in practice, it's probably 20%
Yeah.
stays the same, and then, 40 and 40, or 50 and 30. In other words, older property owners in a reassessment will see a jump in their assessed valuation that the millage reduction will not neutralize, and they will see an increase in their property taxes. Because it's in the aggregate. It is not an individual tax bill neutrality, it's in the aggregate. So the city of Lancaster's tax bill from real estate can only grow by 5% the year following a reassessment. But that does not mean everybody in Lancaster is limited to a 5% increase, because it's in the aggregate.
I'm just trying to think about how it's a process that is not controlled by the city today. It has a large impact on the city because of the age of our properties. And I'm just trying to understand better how that impacts our revenue situation and what you might do to deal with that.
Right. That's a good point.
Reassessment is a very difficult decision at the county level. And, if you look at the chart, Lancaster County did go through it in 2018, but there was, a long period of time prior to that when the last reassessment happened. Typically, it's referred to as the kiss of death for a commissioner
Yeah.
to undertake a reassessment process.
To Lancaster's credit, I remember when the 91 reassessment occurred, that was following a long period. And I believe the county, 96, they had a process in place every 5 to 8 years. They were going to reassess, and they did follow that model for a while. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see this not that big disparity. Even in the middle of that graph, that's not a big gap. I've seen much, much larger gaps. There are counties, there's less of them now, but there are counties that had not reassessed since the 50s. In fact, I think Berks County had to actually prepare maps. They had never prepared maps when they did their reassessment in 90, whenever it was 90. I used to do assessments for the league, so it's sort of up here.
Do they not reassess because it's a high cost to do that? Is that the main
Because of high what?
cost?
I think there are two
That-
reasons. It is expensive to go through it, and it's also a very politically
Yeah.
charged decision to be made.
The high cost is a very convenient political excuse not to do it, but it is a valid cost. And Lancaster, I remember, raised millages. I remember arguing with Terry Kaufman. They raised millages for the length of the time it took to pay down the reassessment cost. And as soon as that was done, they paid as they went. Other counties do not, and that's usually their biggest excuse. And it's not really an excuse. They have tight budgets, and citizens don't want to be reassessed. So unless the county, in my experience, the county starts to bump up against the county tax limit, or you get sued, and the county courts become the assessor, and then they order a reassessment. Typically, county commissioners are marched into a reassessment at the point of a threat. Either you got to do it by the court, or their own financial stability is at stake. Because as Fred said, it is a very difficult decision. I would not want to vote, if I was a commissioner, to make that choice. That is a tough choice. You're voting you're literally voting to change the property values of people in their homes, and they've made their economic budgets based on it. But the opposite is you have to be equitable. So you can't continue an inequitable system. So it's a tough decision.
I think, Amy?
Is it accurate that the assessed value is not the market rate value?
Correct.
Like,
Correct.
and is it common in Pennsylvania for the assessed value to not be 100% of the market value?
It is.
It's probably I think the last time I looked, you can look online. These numbers are all online. The STEB, the State Tax Equalization, actually DCD on their website has a thing called the State Tax Equalization Board. They list every county and the percentage of market value to assessed value. It's called the common level ratio. It gets involved in assessment practices. I want to say there's only 1 or 2 counties that are above 100% right now. Lancaster was one of them. Luzerne was one of them recently. A lot of the people that reassessed in the late 2000s, prior to the real estate problem, the Great Recession, had long periods of assessed valuation greater than market value. But that only means the millage is less. Northampton County in the middle of 90s, in the Pocono land boom, they had done a reassessment around the same time as Lancaster. They reassessed in 1995, but because the property values of the Poconos had shifted, it collapsed. There was a speculation bubble in Northampton County, up where Easton is. That reassessment lowered property values, which meant every town raised the millages. So that went over but that was the consequence. If one side of the equation is not holding it up, the other component of that side has to be changed. That's a long way to go about saying you don't have a problem right now with assessment inequity, but you do have a problem with the cap because you would have to the city can only raise their property taxes about 150% more, and then they will hit their property cap. Okay. Beat that horse?
I guess I have a question.
Sure.
When we're looking at housing and looking at gentrification,
Mhm.
and we're saying, okay, here's houses that are valued, let's just say $100,000. And we see this happening all over the city now. Now these houses are selling at $300,000, $400,000. Where does the city, or is there a way for the city to capitalize on any revenue from that? Because we see this happening throughout the city all the time, especially, I can speak for my neighborhood, but is there a way?
It depends.
Yeah, without a reassessment, no.
Yeah.
You would need a reassessment.
If
in
there
order
was
to do
major
that.
improvements to the property that involved adding on or demolishing and adding to a greater amount, that building permit would trigger a notice to the county to, hey, there's a significant change in the value of this property beyond the value of its original assessment. So typically they would go out and look at it or look at the building permit. That might trigger an assessment. When you have historic districts and you can't expand the footprint and you're only doing interior work or you're doing neighborhood-wide markets or flying, no. Because when you sell the property, you can't change the taxable base based on what it's sold for. It has to stay at the base year of the assessment.
So even real estate, transfer taxes couldn't affect if there was a house.
You
Yeah.
get,
So
that's
then
an
we
inflation-based tax, right?
Yeah, you would get revenue out of the real estate transfer tax if a property changed hands. If it
Right.
didn't change hands, no. But if it's sold at a higher value, then you're going to get the 0.5% realty transfer tax on whatever the selling price was.
And the realty transfer is a fixed tax. Towns that have no cap limits tend to also increase that tax because it's a transaction tax, like a sales tax, but it's a transaction tax that somebody is paying it once.
Right.
So you're making people mad at different times. It's not all at once. So you're paying that, plus it affects, well, hey, I mean, it's taxation, right? Nobody likes taxation,
Right.
but it affects properties of commercial value and residential value, so the bigger the sale, the more you get. So that is a flexibility that some people take advantage of because the realty transfer could be considered a non-resident tax if you're moving in, or if you're not a resident, but a corporation or a company that would be subject to it. It's another way of rebalancing the tax mix. So from that point of view, if gentrification is generating higher housing prices, the city's getting 0.5% every time it's sold.
Right.
But it's not getting long-term improvement
Gotcha.
every year on the tax base.
All right, let's move on to the.
I have a question. Maybe this was answered, not sure. But I think about the reassessment that occurred a while back and how, depending on what neighborhood in the city you lived in, like in some places taxes actually went down and some places taxes went up because we had to adjust the millage. Would a city assessment office potentially prevent that sort of lopsidedness from occurring in the next reassessment?
No, I don't know that it would prevent that. You're still, whether it's the city or the county doing the reassessment, it still needs to be done to certain standards. And you're still going to have winners and losers out of the process, as Mr. Cross described.
So you'd have to have more frequent reassessments to capture the growth.
Okay.
Okay?
Let's move on then to the next slide, dealing with budgeted taxes. This is out of the city's 2023 budget. And you see, I like pie charts because it gives a good visual perspective of what a given subject looks like. But you see the real estate taxes represent virtually 70% of the tax revenue that the city receives. You know, by far and large, that is your largest revenue source from taxes. $32 million, or as I said, 70%. Add into that another $1.5 million from the realty transfer tax, and you're up over 70% of revenue coming from property-based taxes. The earned income tax is generating about $8.5 million, or 18%, and adding in another $1.5 million from the local services tax. At 3%, you're up just over 20% coming from earned income or earned revenues. And then you have a few other items. You have penalties and liens representing about 2%. You do receive what are called pilots or payments in lieu of taxes. Those are coming from nonprofit entities, F&M, hospitals, entities that are nonprofit, so they're not paying a direct real estate tax, but they are making a contribution to the city. It may or may not equate to what they would pay based on a real estate levy, but it's a contribution that is being made in lieu of a tax payment. And then a very small amount under PURTA, which is the Public Utility Realty Tax, which is a tax that is imposed actually by the state on public utilities. You do not tax a public utility, a gas company or electric company for their facilities directly, but they are taxed by the state. And then the city files a report annually, and you do receive a revenue, albeit a relatively small revenue from the PURTA tax.
Now we're on
Okay.
taxes? Yep,
Yeah.
okay.
We'll go to budgeted revenues. This is you.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting my things lined up. The taxes, as Fred said, is a portion of the budget, the total budget, and you'll see that taxes are 67, 2/3% of the total budget, and this is your budget revenues. The other category is there at 12 million. That's the intergovernmental transfers, the indirect cost replacements, the fees. That's also includes $6 million of the American Rescue Plan money, which has a limited life. It's a one-time revenue source. I believe it has to be finished by 2026. So that is a significant part of the city's revenue, budgeted revenues right now, and that will be going away. Your safety revenue codes exceed the earned income tax. They bring in $10 million. And the total, the takeaway here, so we don't go over too much time, total revenues are not sufficient to pay all the budgeted expenses for this year. The budget was actually balanced through the use of its city's fund balance, which is city's savings account. That is not included in this pie chart, but it was over $2 million the city had to put in from its past year savings to balance the budget without increasing taxes or cutting services more than they needed to or wanted to. So as you'll see later on the impact of using both American Rescue Plan dollars and fund balance.
Okay, we're going to look at budgeted expenditures now by type, looking at the expenditure side of the city's ledger. And as we stated earlier, you know, the city is personnel intensive. City services need to be provided by city employees, and hence personnel costs are the largest element of the budget. You have direct compensation that represents just under half of total expenditures, 45%. You add in employee benefits at another 18%, and then pension costs at another 11%. And all told, you're up to about 60 or 74%, 74% of total expenditures. You have the 9% for debt service, and then you have other at $12 million, which are services, utility and maintenance-related services, supplies, and then capital investment into the city's infrastructure, which I might add is relatively low given the size of the city. As I indicated, you know, local government is very labor intensive. Your legacy cost issues are an issue that needs to be dealt with. Their pension and other post-retirement benefits that represent about $1 out of every $10 of city expenditures. And if you look at the chart and compare the blocks on the right, you know, you see taxes representing 68% of total revenues, whereas compensation, including pensions, represents 74% of total expenditures. So your personnel costs are not sufficient, or exceed the revenue generated from taxes. Okay. Jerry?
So now we're going to talk about the function provided by the revenue and the expense budgets. So the city, your task is to determine whether your form of government delivers efficient and effective services. Fred and I like to say it's also essential to the health, safety, and welfare of your citizens. So if you can develop and protect your citizens efficiently, effective, that's a form of government that works. This shows you what you get for your dollars. This puts a face on the efficient and effective delivery of health, safety, and welfare. This police department, you know, not something you can get private sector to provide. It is a security function for citizens. It protects the wealth and the properties that you're taxing. 41%, that's not an unusual number. My experience, that's about right for police, regardless of the city size. If you have a police department, that is the amount of resources it takes. Fire, 13 million. I mean, those people are engaged to wait and to wait for fires, but you want them when there's a fire. So that is a necessary health and safety issue. At 18%, to protect property and life. So this pinwheel consistently goes health and safety. Public Works provides the welfare, in a sense, the ability to leave your home safely, to be able to go to your job, to be able to be protected from the elements. You're protected from nature's impacts. That's Public Works. You also provide for sanitary and safe living conditions by disposal of wastewater and provision of potable water. So looking at this circle of wedges, your efficient and effective government is provided by those three largest slices. I'd argue that's an efficient and effective government. So you are providing an efficient and effective government. The problem is, for how long? As you saw from the earlier limits on revenue, how long can you continue to develop that pie at the stages that you're at going into the future when the revenue pie is not growing at the rate of this? More children picking from this pie, it's not growing. You have a debt service of 8%, which, as we said several times, is very reasonable. And that debt service, by the way, is not pension debt. The pension debt is included in the fire and police. So if you look at the different numbers on this presentation, the one debt service is actually higher. The total debt service the city pays is actually slightly higher, $1.6 million or so. But that provides for pension. So that's not a function, that's a function provided by your police department, a legacy cost. So debt service is what the city is using to pay for different things. And when you look at the overhead of the city, talk about efficient, overhead of the city is about $10 million, 1/6, 1/7 of the cost of your total budget. What's total budget, 69 million?
Yes.
So you're about 1/7, so, 16%, 15%. If your overhead costs, your delivery of services, your administrative overhead is 10%, you can make your own, not 10%, 1/7, you can make your own decisions on efficient delivery of services. But when you look at the budget by functions, that's the dilemma. What do you take out? How do you reduce a budget and still provide health, safety, and welfare in an efficient and effective manner?
I have a few questions about that. Can we go back to the slide?
Which the pie?
Yeah, to the pie. The police, you said that's typical 41%. You said despite the population or despite the size of the city?
Cities, if you have, if Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, when you get into the police business, it is an expensive proposition. Third-class cities, it's hard to imagine not having a police department because density of population requires security for that population.
Sure.
Rural areas, less dense areas, shotgun under the bed works. Necessarily, state police coverage works. Not so in a city. So your cities have, as almost a defining characteristic of safety in a city, is police. Not all cities have fire departments. Correct. Not all cities have paid fire departments. All cities have some sort of fire suppression, otherwise you couldn't afford the insurance. They have fire. You provide fire protection without the need for volunteers like you have in a rural area. You provide a standing army of people ready to respond for a threat from fire or natural emergencies because they help the police and everything else.
So again, this is typical as a third-class city?
It's typical
or
for
just-
urban areas. Boroughs have police departments, denser areas. It's typical, but the more dense your
41% is
population.
typical for that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I personally think the range is probably 30 to 50, 33% to 50. If you looked at the state, if you took all the expenses that the state publishes for municipalities and did a grand total, I would wager a beer 30 to 50%.
Okay. And the debt services, you said that's not the pension of fire and police?
Not on this chart. On the other charts, we lump debt service into all the debt the city pays. On this chart,
Which is what?
6.6 or
6.6 million?
million,
Yeah,
right.
But I
total.
mean, that debt is to what?
The two debts that are in here are pension bonds that the city took out in 2015, I believe.
They refinanced
They
it
refinanced, that helped lower their, they put more money into the pension plan. Because interest rates were low enough, they put money into the pension plan that lowered their future costs by increasing the value of the plan. And they would pay off the debt. So that's included in the police and fire because that was a benefit, or I should say a necessary expense of police and fire. So
Is
here
there
we put it in
anything else
function.
that debt service is
I
paid to?
will have to look that up. That was something, we don't know I could look it up here, but we're already late.
When you said other things, I just wondered what they were.
I don't know, maybe
That's why I
Barry knows road construction, different
Capital, some
Capital
type of
needs.
capital purchases, I'm sure.
leases, that kind of stuff, yeah.
Most of the outstanding debt service is capital bonds, capital improvement.
Yeah,
Yeah,
capital
Capital
equipment, yeah,
improvements.
CapEx,
That's typical of,
a mortgage on heavy purchases. When you're building something, you pay for it over time,
Thank you.
okay?
okay, the next slide that is up there tries to summarize what we've been talking about on the last several slides in terms of both revenue and expenditures. The revenue structure of third-class cities is very limited. It provides low and slow growth over time. From year to year, it just simply does not keep pace with inflation. You know, it's a result of the rate caps that exist, the subjects that are subject of taxation, historical trends, and demographics of urban areas like Lancaster. The city's consultant, PFM, took a look at the budget and did certain five-year projections, which we'll go to in a moment. The five-year projection on revenue growth was 5.5%. 5.5% over 5 years. That's 1%, 1.1% a year. The five-year expenditure growth was 16.4%. Significantly, you know, they are significantly out of balance. You know, the bottom line question is, can the city's financial structure continue to provide necessary services for city residents? Can it continue to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of its residents? That's the fundamental question that I think you need to be looking at in terms of the financial structure of the city.
And I had just a couple questions, probably previous slides. But when we looked at the revenue and under Public Works, what was the revenue that came in under Public Works? So it's only 7%. And then if we can go back to our expenditures,
Public Works expenditures are permits, fees that are
yeah.
assessed, things like that for Public Works related activities.
right. And can we see, yeah, I was trying to see our expenditures.
Expenditures, this
Yeah,
slide,
for Public Works, right. No, I think it's the next
Well,
one.
by,
expenditure, okay.
wait, by function
Right.
here,
So it's 11% and our revenues is only 7%.
7%, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then for our administrative costs, I was looking at, it was very high. I guess we got to go back to the other one. Or forward maybe, where you broke down the administrative cost. It was a little bit under the Public Works cost. No,
Well,
I'm going
they
the wrong
were-
way.
Right,
I'm sorry there.
type, by function.
Right there.
Here, 8.6 million, 12%.
And it's like 12%, and Public Works is like 11%, right? Okay.
Right.
So is those services things that we could look at cutting? I think that's
Well-
very high for Public Works, because, I mean, for administrative costs, if we're not providing safety and health, what the city is
Well,
supposed to
there's a-
provide, what's all under that should,
Well, the biggest part of it is debt service, okay, and that's broken out
okay.
there. That's listed under
Oh, I
administrative
thought the
services.
debt service was the
Right,
8%.
fringe benefits, yeah, because we break it out, but in the administrative services breakdown on the budget for the council gets, it's debt service is 5.6, which you see there. Fringe benefits is 3.4, so between those two, you're over $9 million. The remainder are administrative services, director, accounting, the treasury, information services at $1.6 million, the cost of human resources, community involvement, the insurance package, almost $250,000, $750,000 to insure the city. I'm just
Right,
looking
I
at
think
the
I was
different
looking
budget.
at page 16.
I think, you know, what you're raising are issues that maybe when you go through the interview process,
The budget
you may
that
want
we
to
have
ask
questions.
questions
I
of
mean, they're very
appropriate
close.
people.
You know, Public Works, and we understand how do we get to work, and our water, and our trash.
Right.
And then we look at administrative, and it's more than that. You know,
Well,
I would just,
it depends on the counting definitions. It's easier to define public works as you do police and fire. Depending on how the budget is presented and how the expenses are assigned, you might have stuff that you think is administrative in the sense that it's a person or it's an operation or it's a supplies, but it's really something else. Maybe it's a fringe benefit that's assigned. Healthcare costs for certain employees is assigned to administration as opposed to other areas. I'm just saying that's where you have to look at the budget much more deeper in depth, and that's what we developed these from what the reports the council got. I do want to caution one thing, though. You said that this is something you would look to cut. The charter, the charter's not, you're not charged with managing the current city.
Right.
You're charged with providing a structure for the city to be managed by others under.
Yeah, I didn't say anything about cutting. I was just saying we're looking at, it's so close when you look at
Oh, it is.
administration
Right. It
and
is.
public works.
And I look at that as a balance. That's kind of like the city is providing they're juggling all these balls in the airs, and they're doing all that. There's no one missing component here.
Right. So once we get into the budget, we will see more about what's under public works versus what's under administrative services.
It's very
And
clear.
why those percentages are so close.
Yeah, and it's very clear. You'll see the budget package that we gave you, or that Bernie gave you.
Mhm.
As you go through that, there's a very detailed list, and then the council gets a detailed list. I don't know how often, but you got one in June, right? There's a different expenditure list that the council gets, a report, I should say.
I don't remember seeing it.
Sorry, there are monthly budget
That's it.
reports that are prepared. Council generally gets a extensive budget presentation at the end of the year for the coming year.
And we worked from the June 30th one to develop this slideshow, so that's where
Right.
we were getting from.
And would that be something that the commission could ask for, to see those reports more often? Because I know I was reading in the third class Plan A option, they should be coming out quarterly, at least that they're presenting, or I
Well, they
think
get
it
it
even
monthly.
said, or monthly.
Yeah, they get a monthly, so
Yeah.
I don't see why they wouldn't be available to the commission the last one. You know?
And they come out, yeah. They would be available.
Okay, any other questions?
No.
No? Okay, we're going to go through these next slides relatively quickly because they are the result of the last analysis by the public financial management consultant firm that the city uses. They did a very good report back, I think it was 2020, they projected expenses and such, revenue and expenses for the city. What's important from this, there's a trend there. You see how Fred came up with the 5% gain between 2023 and 2028. The city's revenues are only expected to grow by that much, $3 million. But what the little table I put underneath it interprets the projection. Real estate is only going to project it to grow by 1.7%. That's essentially the baseline, which means they're not raising taxes. This is as if nothing changes today. When you say baseline, that means today's trends continue to the future with no counteractions provided against them, expenditure cuts or revenue increases. You only get a 1.7% natural growth in your real estate tax. That's way below the level of inflation. That is a function of the assessment flat line that we talked about before, okay? Earned income, however, which is a fixed rate, so you cannot increase the rate, you can just rely on people increasing their own personal situation, 22%. So PFM has a 4.5% inflator built into that. When we do these works for municipalities, we typically use 2%. Now you are in a growth area, but our 2% number may be outmoded. The last 2 years, earned income taxes have been exceeding budget projections in almost all the municipalities we worked in by a large amount. So there is something going on as far as increases in wages, whether it's pandemic related or whether it's delayed increases in wages because of the labor situation. But that is the only growth that you'll see in this city's revenue base. Permits and licenses are projected to go down because of the nature of the business. Transfers, those are the intergovernmental transfers, the transfers that you get from reimbursements, only a 5% growth. 1% a year is basically what the projection is. Other revenues are less than 1%, 1.5% over 5 years. All told, total revenues will grow 5.5%, with the lion's share obviously growing $1.7 million, 3 times the value of real estate in earned income tax, $1.7 million versus $500,000. So you see where the impact of a different tax base helps with different sources, but you also see where state legislation crafts the structure the city's working under. Okay? Same thing with the expenditures. This is just another summary chart. Cash compensation is expected to go up by 16% over 5 years. That's about 3% a year. That's contractually obligated, or whatever contracts are already in place, and it's usually considered That's what the trend is going to be for the next 5 years. Health benefits, that's actually very low. That's about 4%. We've seen that it was around 4 to 5% recently, but it was starting to trend up to 6%. It is for the early part of this decade, they were trending at 6% a year increases. Then they did have some amelioration. There was some leveling off. Now we're seeing a 4% increase in health benefits. That's the health insurance provided to employees. Pension has grown by 16%. That's projected increase in pension. That is usually tied to the increase in wages, because as your wages go up, your pension liability increases lockstep. So as everybody gets a raise in their local pay that works for the city, the liability owed to them in the future, when they're done working, is correspondingly increased. The actuaries work that into the pension liability. Operating expenses, 3% a year, under 3% a year increase. Debt service, because of some, the way the bonds are structured and what they're anticipating, debt service is going to increase by $1.2 million to $1.1 million. So your general fund expenditures in total are 16%, which is pretty much cash compensation and health benefits in the numbers game driving that boat. So you see you're delivering services with humans, you're compensating humans, and you're getting services provided, but you're paying for it. So that's your future as far as the consultant's report. The very last one is the net operating result. The city is projected to operate at a loss starting this year. The city has used some replacement funds as we talked. They use more of the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan revenue replacement funds to balance the budget, and they use less of the unrestricted fund balance. But nonetheless, the city did have to dip into savings to pay for a balanced budget this year. The future of using that $4 million or $6 million, the ARPA revenue replacement, PFM says you can't use it after 2025. It'll be exhausted, the amount of money available, and the use of fund balance will be correspondingly exhausted because you'll run out of fund balance. PFM cautions in the report that no one will run the municipality into a hole of $68 million. You can't do it. You have no money. So no government will do that, nor can they do that. So changes have to occur. Something has to occur in the city's basic financial structure, whether it's reduction in services, increase in revenue, a combination of both. Because you cannot continue this trend reasonably, just can't do it, sorry. I worked in a city where they spent all their money and made the national news. Just can't do it. You just cannot do it. The old quote, bankruptcy comes slowly and then all at once. That's what happens when you hit your unrestricted balance. This is the trend that's reflected in that table. The city now has a fund balance in a neighborhood of 15 million. And as they draw it down to balance the budget, if nothing else changes, the city's fund balance will be exhausted in 2 years. And you'll see what happens. The deficits become, you add those, the red bar and the yellow shaded area, that's how much money you're spending that you don't have. So something has to change in the financial or the governing structure of the city. Whether it's provision of services, people on the street, services provided, whatever. The end.
The end. Yes, thank you. Again, I know it's running late, but if there are any other questions, glad to answer them, or, we can discuss that at the next meeting as well.
But
I have a question, if I'm not interrupting. I will listen on the live stream for the response, but I'm just curious, because I've had some conversations with residents about the sort of projection on the screen right now. What would realistically have to change in the millage rate? Like if we maintain the status quo with property taxes, what sort of millage rates would permit us to stay within or stay out of a deficit?
Well, you have the ability to raise taxes by 150%, and your current real estate taxes at 11 mills are 32 million. So in theory, you can go up quite a bit, but you are putting a burden on the taxpayers. And remember the one slide about the lower value of property. Because property is lower, you get less money per mill. your value per mill is 2 million something, I think it is. It's in here somewhere.
A little over two.
So if you want to eliminate a $2 million deficit, you have to increase real estate taxes by at least 1 mil. That's 10%. And you would continue to do that every year by 10 to 15% a year to stay ahead of that curve.
And 1 mil is $2.5 billion.
So if your deficit is 2.5 million, you got 1 mil. And the inverse relationship, the higher the taxes, the less you collect that year because people tend to defer the taxes. It's actually a little bit more. So to stay ahead, you're raising property taxes every year 10%, 9%, 8% into the foreseeable future until you hit the cap. And the cap says you can't raise them any more unless the county judge gives you permission for another 5 mils. Meanwhile, you've taxed your property against your neighbors. You've put a disincentive on living in Lancaster City. You've disincentivized repair. You've disincentivized the attraction of the city in favor of a township where their revenue mix relies heavily on real earned income tax because citizens with their wealth moved to the township. That was the genesis of our 65 report. Meanwhile, the city has a lower income. Historically, cities are a mixture of high and low income. So you have a lower income base, you have a lower property value base, and a high service demand. So it's harmful. I mean, there's a reason why property taxes are controversial. They're very stable, they're very predictable, but they're hard to do everything with.
I have a question. So with all of the building that's going on in the city, and most folks probably being earned income individuals, there's so many buildings that are coming into the city. And so that income base is going to rise. How does that play into how this could impact, how it could become more of a revenue for the city?
Oh, the
That kind of growth.
building, new construction is going to generate additional real estate revenue. If it's residential construction and the individuals are employed, then that's going to generate earned income revenue as well. You did see on the projections that the projection on earned income went up about, I think it was 22%.
27%.
Yeah, whereas real estate revenue was projected to only grow up by about 1.7%. So I'm not sure how much building is occurring, but at least the projections did not show a significant increase in real estate value, whereas it did show a fairly significant increase in earned income revenues.
Yeah, if you look at that chart, the revenue, the assessed valuation chart, that shows you the trend is flat. And remember, in that flat trend is new construction. That flat trend from 2008 to 2017 includes all the new construction in the city. The problem is your tax base is $2 billion. So, at 1% growth, you're picking up 200 some million, right? If it's 2 billion. But that's not a lot in the general scheme of things.
But what about the growth between 2023 to 2025?
Well, they projected it would be similar to the past few years at 1%. What was it, 1.1%?
Yeah.
Actually, it's 1.7%.
7%.
It's less. They kept it flat. That's about 0.3%. They kept it flat, which I would have done too if I was doing that projection. Real estate is flat.
Thanks. I was thinking about this too, and I think your initial question got to what I think made an important connection to me, which was that, okay, the building itself has marginal value to the overall revenue of the city, but the people that live there are earning income, which is currently limited to what is allowed by state law. But if you look at the projection over time, that's where all the growth is, 22%, that earned income then becomes available to the city in the form of revenue, especially if we're talking about, take the North Queen Street Tower, for example, right here. The people that work in that building, They're living downtown. There's no parking spaces. I think maybe there's a garage or something. They're gonna work in the city. Probably. We're gonna capture that revenue.
The issue, though, is, and I agree with what Carl is saying on the revenue side, but understand revenues are projected in the aggregate to only increase about 5.5%, expenditures by slightly over 16%. It's out of kilter, it's out of balance. So you can't operate the city in an unbalanced manner over the long term.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Was this helpful? This
Very much, at least for me, speaking for myself,
back,
absolutely.
give and take and back and forth?
Yes,
Good information.
yes, the interaction, yes.
And we will receive the PowerPoint, correct?
Yes, that's going to be, I hesitated to provide it before because I didn't want you to, I wanted you to pay attention tonight, but it's going to be part of the public record and you'll get a copy. I think Bernie has copies for you.
And it'll be posted, I'm sure.
And there was also stuff provided for you beforehand. I provided the case studies for the different cities from our report. So the 5 cities and townships that were
Is this the same thing?
profiled, Lancaster's one of them. It compares their, that was, I think I gave that to you.
Did we get that?
That was part of the big package, the PDFs, the report.
Part of 1960.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I took
Not
pages out of it and sent you excerpts.
Right.
Like I took pages out of the taxation manual and just sent you those pieces.
Yes.
So you could just read those pieces, so to get a background for tonight.
And I appreciate that. Limited homework is always good.
Yeah, I apologize for sending 150 pages when
Focus.
15 worked.
Focused homework, yes. Okay, are there any more questions about the budget and taxation process? All right, great, thank you. Moving on, PL, and I'm not sure how much, we were under such a short time frame. How much, Ms. Bird, you and Mr. Dasher were able to work with them in developing interview questions. We should all have gotten a copy of them. There are questions, I think we actually originally asked for questions for the mayor and the president of council. You also provided questions for the controller and treasurer. I appreciate that being proactive, that adding it on. What I would recommend right now is what we can do, instead of saying, coming up with a motion, if we want to discuss this, just move to a committee of the whole to discuss this, make any changes right now before we make any decisions on approval or how we're going to proceed with them. So without objection. So effectively, we are in what would be called the committee of the whole. What does anybody want to, what questions, issues, comments would you like to make? Mr. Feldman, yes.
I just wanted to say that I thought the questions were pretty good, and I didn't really feel the need to amend them in any way, and would be happy to see them approved right now.
Just a few changes, and I think we say the optional charter plan, and it should say Plan A, because that's the way we operate. I think there's some language in there where we talk about the charter, and we should kind of keep it optional third-class charter A, because that's how the city's operating.
This is a question to who? The questions for who?
I'm just looking at the questions for the mayor, but I'm
for the
saying
mayor.
in general, yeah. We put that A on there so people understand, that's how we operate. And I have a lot of questions that I feel was not asked, but I feel like I can wait till we interview the mayor in person and ask those questions. I don't think it should hold us up from moving forward to getting written answers, if that makes any sense.
My thought would be that what we could do, we will come up with our agreement on these questions, any changes we wanted to make, provide them to the mayor, president, treasurer, and controller in the next few days, and ask, I would think a reasonable time frame would be 45 days. It would get them
time to answer them without their being rushed. It would also get us 2 weeks response to all of us 2 weeks before the next time we would have our monthly meeting. So we would all have 2 weeks to review their answers so we could discuss them at the meeting. That would be my time frame.
I think it's too long to answer the questions. We had less time to come up with the questions.
Well, this is true.
45 days is way too long. I mean, we're on a time limit as a commission, and if we want to
And
even
we only
have a
have
chance to
minutes.
interview them after we talk to them, I think we need to, at least, I don't see there's no problem in asking them to provide us answers sooner. If they come back and they say, hey, I can't do it, that's something else. But I think we should ask them to produce answers sooner than 45 days.
What time frame would you have in mind? What are your suggestions? Just curious.
Okay, well, I was thinking, I wasn't not thinking near that long, but, since he said 45 days, I would say 2 to 3 weeks. I think that's reasonable that they have, I mean, I would have said 2 weeks, but since you said 45 days, I'd be willing to say 3 weeks, but I think 2 to 3 weeks,
Okay,
2 weeks.
yeah, please, Mr. McGrann, please.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's not going to take any of the people involved 45 days to prepare their replies, and I think if we give them 45 days, they're going to complete their response in the 2 or 3, between days 40 and 45. So I think if we put an earlier deadline on it, I think that's perfectly appropriate. If they have circumstances where they can't meet that earlier deadline, they can tell us that. But I think we've also heard from the city that they, are eager to support our work and to be as responsive as possible. So I think that we can reasonably expect a quicker turnaround.
I think the same. These are questions that are directed towards people who've been doing the work for a long period of time. So I think that they could answer these questions relatively quickly, 2 weeks, maybe 3, but then for us to have more time to review all of their answers, to understand them in depth.
Well, my thought would be, I would like a minimum of 2 weeks for us to get the questions before we meet, the answers before we meet. So if we think in terms of, if we agree to send these out today, if they go out officially, say Monday, we really only have 3 weeks. That would give them about 10 days to get them back for the September meeting. So we're now talking, if we want them 2 weeks before we meet, we would have to have them back from them by August 15th. It's August 3rd now.
Well, with giving them 45 days and then giving us 2 weeks, still would have taken us beyond September.
It takes us to
6th.
October.
Yeah.
Either way, we move into October. That's my point.
I think Carl has his hand up, then I have a
Yes.
question.
I just wanted to say that I feel like, it seemed, I don't know if we're at full consensus, but we're closing in on a consensus that we'd like faster than 45 days. I feel like the chair's heard that. Instead of us kind of nitpicking how long they have, can we just approve these questions and let the chair set that for us?
And I'd like to say we are not nitpicking. We are basically coming up with a time and everyone have their opinions heard about that.
And I would just ask, why are we saying we need their answers within 2 weeks?
I
mean,
would
if
be
we-
happy with a week before.
Yeah,
I
think
can, if
I
I
think at
know
least
that
a
they're
week
coming a
before.
week before, I'll carve out time to read all of the
Yeah.
questions.
I think a week before is good for us to, and I think we want to allow time to interview them in person if we have additional questions. I mean, I had additional questions, but I'm fine with sending these out as getting a response so we can keep moving. And I would only ask for one change, and that would be number 2, for the mayor, if we could say why. Because we don't ask her why. The optional charter plan, a form of government, that's the
Question number
executive.
2.
Yeah. At that first question, can we just say why?
The first question or the second
The
question?
second well, there's 2 questions on
The second
number
part
2.
of number
So
2.
the first part of number 2, if we could say
Add
why.
in a what?
Add a why.
Sure. Mr. McGrath?
But I'm good with these questions, and I think 2 weeks, and Carl, I agree with you that we should just agree on a time and move on.
Mr. McGrath, you had a comment?
I was just going to say what Amy said. I think we can be counted on to, if I know this is coming with a week prior to our meeting, that works for me.
I agree with that. I think I thought the questions were very well written, and I would agree with that as well.
Okay, so I would accept a motion to accept these questions to send out to the mayor, president of city council, treasurer and controller. Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion to send these questions out to the mayor, city council, treasurer, and controller.
Is there a second?
I second it.
The motion been made and second. I think we can just go with a voice vote. We don't really need to call a roll call vote. All in favor, or any discussion, any official discussion? You wanted to make one change. We made the one change, adding the term "why" in question 2 for the mayor.
Right. Is there going to be a time included in this motion?
The original motion did not, in keeping with what Mr. Feldman had pointed out, we would send them out and get with the idea of a timely,
Faster than 45 days.
faster than 45 days.
Can we make it 2 weeks?
You can amend the motion to say we would like the responses in 2 weeks.
Yes.
So you have
I would
a
like to.
motion that we should add a specific 2 weeks to that.
Yes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion on 2 weeks? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Hearing no, so that motion passes. So the motion now says that we will send them out to be, and ask them to have a response in 2 weeks. Is there any more discussion?
I would just say that we're not going to be unrealistic if somebody's on vacation,
Right.
something like that. I think the goal is that we would get them a week before our next meeting.
Understood. Any other discussion? Okay, hearing none, I ask for a vote in favor of the motion with a request for 2 weeks, a response within 2 weeks. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed? Okay, hearing none, that motion pass. Next item is next officials to interview. I had mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that I thought that adding questions for the 2 state representatives for Lancaster City might be prudent. That's just my opinion. If somebody wants to, are there any others, any questions, ideas, thoughts, who else might be? Yes.
I just think if you're going to ask members of our state legislative delegation, you probably should include our state senator, Scott Martin.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with that.
Okay. Is anybody else that you might want to put on a list?
The only thing I'll say now, I know we haven't gotten to directors yet, but I'm still curious about the idea of interviewing our chief planner, because the Lancaster City Planning Commission is the only planning commission that actually can, when the planning commission votes against a project, the project doesn't happen, as opposed to other municipalities where it's just a recommendation. I know we haven't gotten to directors yet, but I just wanted to reiterate my interest in interviewing the chief planner.
Okay. Would that be something we should put into the next round, or should we approach that as into the next round of questions, or wait and come up with that as another one? Or-
Brian,
Yes.
could I ask PEL for their recommendation on who we should interview next? Or send interview questions to?
Absolutely. Any recommendations from PEL?
I believe that department directors, once you finish with the elected officials, which is your first area of focus, then I think the department directors would be next. And if you want to include, as Tony indicated, the planning director as part of that group, that's fine.
At a minimum, the 6 department heads on the organizational chart.
Would the commission or PEL recommend that we work on that now or add those in as a follow-up after the elected officials?
Well, I think as the initial focus right now is going to be on the elected officials, but over the next several weeks, if you want to have a subgroup of the commission work with us on questions for the department directors over the next several weeks, we can, certainly work with you in that regard.
Yeah, you'll get an understanding of the elected official's role, the mayor's role as the oversight of the responsible person for all the departments. And then you'll get that information back, and then understanding where all the players see themselves and how they see themselves responding to the mayor and all the other elected officials, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what I would suggest, if we could ask PEL, anyone on the commission would like to work with them on questions for the state representatives, state senator, please identify yourself. Yes.
I would.
Ms. Byrd, anybody else?
I'll identify myself.
Okay, Mr. Dastra, anybody?
I'll just email you again.
Okay. And absolutely, if anybody wants to provide questions separately, I will forward them on to those working with them and the PEL as well. So I don't think there's any need for a motion on that. That'll be the plan for the next. One question, should we include the directors now or wait?
I'm okay with waiting just so we can really focus on state legislature level subjects.
Okay, sounds good to me.
That sounds like a good plan.
All right, so that will be what our plan to go forward from there. Any other items under next officials to interview? Okay. I know the item says for a budget update, as I have said over many years, sometimes an update is that there's nothing more to report. But do you have any additions? You did provide us with, I think, a starting budget.
Starting draft budget to the chair, based on conversations with the cities, I shouldn't say conversations, the city's grant office reviewed it. Because it's a component of a grant that the city's going to ask for, so your subcomponent is what we budgeted out. The only difference is we budgeted for 18 months, 9 months right now, 9 months prospectively. The grant is for 12 months. So the amount of money there for 18 months is prospective. The city has to ask for a certain amount every year, so they're going to ask for the 12-month limit. There'll be a little bit of a hangover. But the city's funding you now, so if they're funding you for 6 months, and so that's the update.
Any questions on the budget? Ms. Byrd?
Yes, we had talked about having meetings in the community, and I gave the city clerk a list of places, and people talked about maybe some expense. Is that included on this budget?
Yeah.
It is, okay.
Well, there's public meetings.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Where's our public meeting? You got it.
I must have missed it.
Promotion.
On promotion, the total, city services in kind.
Right.
That would be like meeting rooms in the city hall and the city providing spaces to meet. There's really no expense to a public meeting other than the advertising that you're going to do, and that's covered by advertising. So I think that's covered by in kind, right? I have it as in kind? So the city's going to be providing, I assume, this is my assumption. If I'm wrong, that's your job.
Okay, so I think at the last meeting I provided the clerk with a list of places that we could meet throughout the city, and there was a cost factor, and I said,
Well,
would that be included
We
in our
did not receive
budget?
that, so if there's a cost factor,
Okay,
that's something you could work with the draft budget over the next month or two. But there is a line item for that, you just have to
okay,
make it as part. Right now, it's in kind, which means the city is providing it without your budget being affected. What I hear from you is you're gonna have to have a budgeted number, that's the commission's responsibility. If somebody wants $250 for their room, you're gonna have to pay it out of your budget. That's how I'm hearing it.
okay.
I don't think the city would be writing a check.
So
and
that would
claiming-
come out of commission budget
I
down
think,
here?
I think that would be
Okay.
a legitimate expense that you spent.
Okay, got you.
If you could provide that to me, I can forward it on, and
Yeah, what I did is I talked to 9 different places, churches and different places that would set up as a possibly community meeting throughout the city. We did get another call about school, maybe using a school, and most of them said there would be a cost factor. They didn't say what. It really depended on what we were asking of them. And I think at the last meeting, Tony said he would do the live streaming, because that was a question, would they have to do the live streaming? So I guess when we would be able to say what we need of them, they would be able to tell us what that cost factor is.
Yeah, Ms. Berg, when I mentioned, it's all city money.
Okay.
You don't have your own revenue. So
I know.
the city, it's all city money. What you have to report in your final report is how much you directly spent towards the activities of the commission, understanding that the money came from the city. So when I say it'll be your expense, you'll list that in the final report as your expense. Okay, the city's in-kind could be listed if you want it to be. But they're using it for a grant match, so that's a whole different function.
okay, thank you. Any other questions?
So
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Dasher.
Ms. Bird's absolutely right. I did say I would live stream. I just want to say, or ask rather, I'm not sure when our next meeting is, like if we're going to set up another one for August. But also, when we get to that stage of planning the external events, if we want to live stream right to the city's YouTube page, I think I'll need to be connected with the city's communication team, just so that I'm all set up and ready to go for those events.
Okay, I'm assuming that Mr. Harris, you'd be able to work with him on whatever arrangements have to be made. Okay, we've moved on from the budget, so we're into the other item, and one item I had under the other was the actual idea of, what I was thinking, some public information meetings, I think is what the term I was trying to come up with. This would be a series of meetings. We unofficially have 4 quadrants. I would see trying to set up over, probably by the end of the year, 4 additional meetings. So if we have our normal monthly meeting, the possibility of a second in the middle of the month meeting, but the idea being strictly for the public to come in and take it out to the public. Ms. Bird, you and I had discussed this a little bit. You had brought this up before. So is that something that we should be doing?
I would like to bring up in relationship to this that I asked Stephen Medvick and Burwood Yost at F&M to draft up a summary of the different types of public engagement so that we all have a baseline of what that means, what a town hall is, what a survey is, what a focus group is, what a deliberative forum is. And I just got that a day or 2 ago, so I was going to send that around and enter it into the official notice that we could discuss at our next meeting. Burwood said he was willing to come to that meeting and answer any questions for us. I think they're very important, but I also think it's important that we do things that are going to give us information that is helpful.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Feldman.
I just think that the idea, their office does a lot of public engagement, so I'm excited that you have that, and it seems like a good thing for us to discuss at our next meeting in September.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is we should wait until the September meeting to formalize this. And you said you would be able to get, F&M might be able to come in
and give us some
Yes, they
sort of
would come in.
information. Okay. Are there any items for this meeting?
So no second meeting in August?
I will say that meeting in August is always problematic just because it's August. August creates, between vacations and back to school, always creates problems. Unless there is a specific agenda that somebody has to meet in August.
I would second that. That's really challenging. But one thing I could do is I could look at dates in September, October, November, and December, and just ask everybody for, I'll do it a little bit more official this time, like a doodle poll, so it's a little bit less chaotic. And you all can, like every 2 weeks, not that we would actually do that, but that we would know who is available if we needed
Okay.
to have a meeting.
Sure.
Not to actually schedule anything, just to know people's availability.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Any other items?
I just want to mention, I did speak to Saka, Jose, and they have a podcast, and any commissioner that would like to go and speak, not as a commission, but individual commissioners to educate people, they are willing to let people come over and speak on the podcast.
Thank you. Any other item? Yes.
Ms. Bird, could you share that via email so I don't lose track of it? It was just a little hard to, sorry about the audio issues I'm having.
Yes, I'll send that to you.
Thank you.
Any other items? Okay, hearing none. Do I have a motion to adjourn? There's a
Second.
motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Any objection? Hearing none, we are adjourned.
Good night, everybody.
Yes, it's pretty cool now.
Yeah, that's right.
See ya. Brian,
He said that's what we're doing, because I thought you could do 2 years, right?
You're gonna make fun of me for driving a big
I feel like
metal
we
box?
should have